following lecture was given by Paul Stevens on the 9th of March 2019 at the Oriental Numismatic Society Study Day. The Oriental Numismatic Society holds regular study days in all the countries in which it's active. The next study day in the UK will be held in Oxford on the 22nd of June. If you're interested in the Society or its activities, please visit its website for further information.
Okay, well, I've called it 1862 Rupees and New Reflections, and I'm going to go reasonably quickly so that I leave Karen time to play. So, just to remind you, before 1835, rupees for the East India Company in India looked different in the different presidencies. One thing they had in common was that they all had fixed dates, and they had fixed dates to overcome the problem of barter, which is where the shroffs or local bankers were debasing the value of coins based on their age. And it wasn't very fair because actually the coins hadn't got worth very much less in terms of silver, but it was a good way for the bankers to make a profit. Not that bankers like to do that nowadays. So there were three different types, and in the 1820s there was big discussion going on about should we have one type of rupee for all of British India, and eventually it was agreed that there would be, and that it would contain or show the head of the King of England, who of course was not Emperor of India. That didn't happen for years, and some inscription on the back showing the value. And from 1835 to 1840, this is what the rupees looked like. But of course you will remember that he died in 1835, but the problem was they couldn't produce a good picture of the new queen in India until they got dies from India in 1840, in which case they changed the look of the coins to have the head of Victoria. And there are two types of these sorts of coins, one called the continuous legend type, one called divided legend, for obvious reasons. After 1857 and the Indian Mutiny, the British government took over control of India directly, so the East India Company no longer had any say, and they decided that they would have a new type of rupee, which looked like this. And the first of these were produced in 1862, and coins dated 1862, looking like this, were produced until at least the end of 1873, and possibly early into 1874, when they decided to put the dates on the coins. So from 1874, you have coins dated with the year they were produced. Now this means that these coins were produced over many years and in hundreds of millions. So of course there are lots of different varieties of these coins, and I just want to mention one particular variety here because I promised this chap I would, and this is a new variety that's recently been discovered. We're calling it the CJL variety, and you can see here the initials CJL. And this was first reported to me by a chap called Noman Nazir. But Amit Sarana has done lots of work on this coin, and he's written a paper which will be in our journal. I'm not sure if it's in the one coming out next or the one after. Anyway, I want to draw your attention to it because it's an interesting paper, and it's the first paper he's ever written, and I think it's a really good example of a new numismatist having a go at something. Now, I just mentioned Calcutta Mint was the major producer of these coins in terms of numbers, and there are many, many varieties of the Calcutta Mint coins, and they involve little things like, is there a cone here, or what does that bud look like? And very small differences. And Randy Weir and I published a book a few years ago where we had lots of different varieties of these coins. And some people have had real problems with that because they're tiny differences. And Randy asked me last year sometime, could I think about making it simpler? So I've done that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. What it made me do, though, was to look at other coins, other 1862 coins, which are produced or were produced in the Bombay Mint. And these coins have dots on the reverse, and you can see some dots there. And I want to talk about these 1862 coins with dots on. And the dots occur in different places. So you can see here dots at the top. So here's a dot, and on the coin over there you can see two dots up at the top, but they also occur at the bottom, just above the flower here. And you get them with a range of dots. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and on, I think I might come back to that 10, but whilst I'm here, I'll just point out, see there's something there, and there's something there. Now, collectors in India have gone absolutely mad about these dotted coins, and any mark that occurs on a coin, they call a dot, and they will ascribe it some value. Well, I mean, these are just imperfections in the die or damage on the coin, and they're not dots of any significance at all. So that's something to be aware of if you start looking at these coins. Here's one with 12 dots, bit of a blurred photo, but you can see it's slightly different. The dots go all the way around there, and then there are 2 more there. There are also a few other odd things that we find with these dots. So first thing, tiny dots. So you can see here, tiny dots. Now they actually occur quite frequently. Dot in the bottom flower here, and you find this on, there are quite a lot of specimens with this dot on it. So it is a dot. And dot in the top flower, again, similar thing. So the dots are not just sort of regular. There are other dots that occur on these coins. So what do they mean? And this is where it starts getting more interesting. In 1893, there was a report in the newspaper called The Times of India, and the report was there because people were worried that they had found these coins with dots on, and the dots meant that they were fakes. So an article was published in the newspaper saying, no, they're not fakes. They were produced in the Bombay Mint, and the dots were a dating system, because bear in mind all the coins dated 1862. Somebody in the Bombay Mint had put dots on to date the coins. And then these people, Garside, Wodak and Remick, who names you'll recognise as very famous collectors, followed this up and started looking for coins with dots on to try and work out what this dot dating meant. In the 1970s, Falk and Clark, 2 Americans, published a paper where they worked out the sequence of all these dots and how they matched with the dates. And this was copied by Pridmore in his book that he published round about the same time as Falk and Clark. And I've simplified it here just to show you where I started getting worried about it. So what they said was, here are the dates and here are the dots. 1 dot at the top and no dots at the bottom meant 1863. And you can see, I won't go through all of them, but I'll just choose a few. So here, no dots at the top and 4 at the bottom, or 1 at the top and 4 at the bottom, or 2 at the top and 4 at the bottom, all mean the same thing. I don't like the feel of that, you see. And it gets even worse down here, where you have 0 over 11, or 1 over 10, so that's okay, you add up 1 and 10 is 11, or 0 over 1, I don't know how that gets 11. Or 1 over 1. So there you've got to assume that 1 is a decimal, so it's 10, and the other one is a 1 to make 11. And I just don't like that very much. A chap called Sharif published a book which was a catalogue of all these coins, unfortunately at almost exactly the same time as Pridmore. So his book was completely ignored, and Pridmore's catalogue dominates the whole series. But Sharif wrote at the time, some people greatly admired and blindly accepted the dots as indicators of dates, blocking the way to further inquiry, and so on. As it is speculation or blind belief, he says. And I thought, I had a copy of the book, and I thought, well, that's quite interesting. I'll have another look. And I thought, well, actually, he could be right about this, because if I go back to the evidence that was originally used to say that these dots were dates, I have to assume that the report in the newspaper was accurate. I mean, we all know that newspaper reports are extremely accurate, don't we? So perhaps they were as good as in those days as they are today. And then I thought, well, actually, the person who wrote the original book on colonial coins was somebody called Atkins, and he published his book in 1889, quite a long time before the report in the newspaper. So it's entirely conceivable that the report in the newspaper came from Atkins' book. And where did Atkins get the idea that these dots were dates? Well, guess what? He gives absolutely no references to anything. So he might have just made it up because it looked like a good idea. And that's where I left it for several years, because I thought, actually, this is a bit dodgy. And my good friend Bandari here also thought that. So we sort of colluded in this idea that we're not sure about dot dating. Now, because Randy had asked me to start looking at the 1862 rupees again, I thought one day when I was in the British Library, I'll just have a look and see if there are any records I can find about the Bombay Mint around this time. And there are some records, and it's quite clear that Pridmore didn't find the records. Unfortunately, they are only abstracts. All the detailed records must still be in India. So there's a lot of work for somebody to do in the records office in Delhi. And it's not going to be me. I'm not going there to do it. But somebody could do something good with this. And I do keep mentioning to people in India they should go there, but they don't seem to want to do it. Right, so what did I find? I found this, an entry in 1871, a letter from the officiating mint master in Bombay. So this is official stuff. And he said, a private mark to distinguish the year of coinage has been used in the mint since 1864. So there are two important things there. A private mark was used, and it started in 1864. But this does not prove that the private mark was a dot, although to me this now seems highly likely. More importantly, it doesn't mean that all dots are to do with dates. So that's quite important, I think. So why would you want to add the dots to put dates on anyway? Well, as I've said, the original date for keeping the same date was to stop the Shroffs devaluing older coins. By the 1860s, that wasn't a problem because for nearly 100 years, the coins all had fixed dates, so Shroffs couldn't debase the coins. So it wasn't a problem by then. And early in the 1870s, as I've already said, they decided to start putting dates on the coins. Presumably, somebody in Bombay in the 1860s thought, well, actually, we could put dots on and use them as dates. But they must have thought that the Shroffs would see them. I mean, they weren't stupid, they were clever people, and they would be able to work out they were dates. But did that really matter? Probably not. Okay, so that's one sort of line of thought I've been following. The other thing I found were the mintage figures for these coins, monthly mintage figures. So there's a mintage figure for every month by denomination, but we're only talking about rupees here. You can see here all the months and all the mintage figures, and I won't go into great detail, but I'll just point out that in 1871 there were no rupees produced. How do they compare with Pridmore's mintage figures? Well, they don't, really. So I've no idea where Pridmore got his figures from, but they're wrong. If I take calendar year, as you can see, they don't really match very well at all. So I thought, well, perhaps he worked on the financial years somehow. So I tried comparing those, and they match up sometimes quite well, but other times not at all. So I have no idea where Pridmore got those figures from, which is worrying, actually, because he's usually incredibly accurate, even though he gives no references, so it's hard to know where he found anything. Oh, yes, I just wanted to say, 1871 had no coins produced, so there shouldn't be any dots for that year, unless they did it for the financial year, in which case the coins should be extremely rare. And actually, well, I'll come back to that. When were the dots added is another question that one might ask. So we have a record that I found, again, just recently, of die production at Calcutta in 1846. So I think we can probably safely assume that 20 years later it was more or less the same. And this is how it worked. A matrix die produced 6 puncheons. A puncheon produced 100 dies. One die produced 20,000 coins. So multiply it all up and you get one matrix die produces 12 million coins. Okay. Now, if you remember the numbers that I just showed you, 20 million coins a year would not be an unreasonable number. That would take 1,000 dies, approximately. But some years, they produced 80 million coins. So you'd need a lot more than 1,000 dies to do that. So how did they manage it then? Because you can't keep making matrix dies. Well, you can, but not too often. Well, actually what they did was to take some of the dies that they produced early on and reuse them as matrix dies. And the problem is that when you do that, the quality of the dies that you're producing from it gradually deteriorates. So you need people to work on them to try and make them better, so that you get lots of differences. So you get hundreds of die varieties, which is really good for collectors, because you could collect 1862 rupees now forever and still never get all the varieties. So when would they have added these dots to get them onto the coins? Well, they wouldn't have added them to the matrix die. They could have added them to the puncheon, but you'd have to then add the dots in relief, and I don't really know how you would do that. I mean, perhaps you can, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that would be very difficult. So that means you'd have to add them to the die. So that means each year they would have had to put the dots on at least 1,000 dies and up to 4,000 dies, which sounds quite a big job. And obviously they wouldn't have put them on the coins. So most likely they added them to the dies. I don't know what this tells me, but that's probably what happened. So I just thought, well, Pridmore's thing is so complicated. Why if I was adding dots to date things and I had to add the dots to 1,000 or 4,000 dies, I want to do a simple thing. So I'll just add one dot for 1864. You remember that's when he said they first started dating them. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, that's fine. And guess what? 8 dots should be quite rare. and they are quite rare. So it seems to me they were probably dating them from the financial year, and they were doing it like this. And all those other complications are totally unnecessary. People who were looking at it assumed that all the dots were to do with dates. Well, I would say that that's not true. The tiny dots that appear quite frequently are probably reused dyes where they've tried to scrub out the dots but haven't very successfully. The dots in the flowers probably mean something else. And where we have funny combinations of dots, like 1 at the top and 10 at the bottom, it probably means something else. It's just the ones at the bottom that mean dates, and everything else means something else. Now, what do they mean? Well, your guess is as good as mine. It could be anything. It could have been a particular engraver decided that he was going to mark his dies in a particular way for some reason, or anything else you can dream of. Thank you.